All right, everybody. The first couple videos, hopefully, though they went kind of quick, you kind of get an understanding of where we're headed. Once again, what we're trying to do now and what we're going to focus on the rest of this semester is taking the programs that you've written, and we'll do some new ones also, and basically modularize those programs where you're going to take your code that you've already written and put them into their own procedures based upon the code doing one thing. What do we mean by that? Well, how's it, what's it doing? Again, every piece of code or combination of code should have one purpose. And if you remember what I showed you before from where we're headed, the one purpose for calculate accessories was we're just calculating the accessories. This was code that was already written in my previous program that was not modularized. What I did was is I put these accessories, this calculation, into its own procedure. Why again? Once again, to make it easy, make it easier to read. You may disagree with that right now. I contend that you probably will as you first look at this. Don't do that. Try to keep a fresh mind here and a positive attitude about it, because this is how we write programs in the real world. Remember when we talked about the benefits of this, being able to enhance it very quickly, being able to understand it very quickly, being able to maintain it easier, being able to possibly do reuse on code that you've already written, and so on. Does that make sense? Okay, so in this case right here, if we just kind of read here and we say calculate the car price, the first thing we're going to do is calculate the AF price. I go down to calculate AF price, this is calculate the accessories again, and then calculate the finish. It tells me the story. So if I asked you to take this program, okay, if I asked you to take this program and enhance it and add a new accessory to it, you could very easily come into the program, okay, say, okay, calculate car price. I'm going to go there. It's sort of like going to that chapter in a book, AF price, so that's accessories and finish, accessories, and I'm going to enhance it right here. It almost points to it, just like you outline a book. Does that make sense? That's what we're trying to accomplish. Yeah, and hopefully you see the original code that we had before is still there. There's some new stuff we need to learn, like what this by ref and what that double means and what's all that stuff in brackets means. We'll talk about that as we keep going on. But for the most part, what we're doing is breaking our code down and making it and outlining our code and make it easier to read and enhance and maintain and write, I contend, and so on. Not for these smallish programs, for the ones that you're going to be doing that's 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000 lines long when you actually hit industry. But you want to practice this skill now so you know what you're doing when you get there. Does that make sense? All right, I keep repeating that, but I want to make sure you hear that and you get this why in the back of your head so you can accept what you're about to learn a little bit easier. So the first thing we need to sit back and look at is, well, where do we start at with something like this? Well, I'm going to introduce you to what I call a structure chart. It's something I've been using for many, many years, and yet so it's a little bit old school, but I think it works really well here. And what the structure chart represents is how we're going to break down our code and how this whole process of modularization actually works. In doing so, I use Visio. You could use anything. If you already have Visio based upon other courses you're taking, perfect, use it. Just the basic shapes will work. All you gotta do is just grab one of these things here, bring it over and start typing in it, and it actually works in that case there, okay? There you go, right there. I'm gonna get rid of that. And you see how that works. All you gotta just drag it over and start typing in it. All right, if you never used Visio before or you don't have Visio on your machine, you could use Excel, you could use Word. They all have shapes and stuff you can use for that. Or if you like to, just use pen and paper and take a picture of it before you upload it if I ask you to upload the structure chart. So what the structure chart's representing is really an outline. It could be like an outline of a paper. It could be an outline of anything have you ever done in regards to this. This outline basically has what's called the main routine. In this case, our main routine, for the most part, will always be that button click. It doesn't have to be a button click. You guys know that by now. But for the most part, will always be the button click, that main routine, okay? And as you're not going to do this for buttons that exit or buttons that clear. This is mostly for the buttons that does the main processing. You may have a couple buttons that do different processings in the future. If that's the case, you would do one of these for both of them. For the remainder of this particular course, well, I don't want to say that. You're going to have one button click per form. I would say which would have a main procedure to it, a main process. I say it like that because we will get into multiple forms here in a few weeks. Okay. With that all said, this main routine, this is the button click. Okay. And what this button click is going to do is it's going to call one of three. Could be all three, could be one of these, could be two of these, or all three of these. They should be considered. For the most part, there'll always be three of them. I would say probably 90% of the time. But there could be times where you don't do one of these three. So to me, this is like the chapters, okay? That every one of your main processings will always have three chapters to it. Think of it as a book. The first chapter is going to be get and validate input. The reason I sit back and tell you that you may not have this, if I don't have any input to validate, maybe everything is, you actually wrote a program, I think already, where all you had was check boxes and radio buttons. You didn't validate anything. You wouldn't have this. But if you have any data that you need to input data that needs to be validated and needs to be gotten, meaning I got to get it off the screen and get it into my variables, you will have a function, or not a function, a procedure that will do that, the main one, okay? So this is called get and validate input. This is called calculations, and this is called display. So sort of what I told you before, there's four pieces to writing a program. Declaring your variables, which we're going to do, and actually do the exact same way that we did before, okay, with the same scope. Get and validate inputs, do your calculations, and display. And that's pretty much what this is showing. This is where you start, okay? The next piece of this is sitting back saying, okay, that's all well and good. Now what do I do? Well, the whole idea is that how this thing kind of works is the main routine is going to call down to get and validate inputs, okay? Once the get and validate input procedure, okay, let's consider this a little person down here, is going to get the inputs and validate it for my main routine person, okay? So let's just pretend we have a person up here. We'll call her Mrs. Smith, okay? So Mrs. Smith is going to call down to Mr. Validate and say, hey, can you get this input for me? And he'll say, yeah, okay, I'll get the input. I'll validate it. As soon as I get it for you, I will pass it back to you. And that's how this works. Mrs. Smith will then see it, say, hey, thank you, Mr. Validate, appreciate it. I'm going to call Mrs. Calculations down here now, pass her down that validated input to have her do her calculations. Does that make sense? The calculations, Mrs. Calculations will then send back up. Hope you're getting a visual of this. Send back up the results of those calculations. Mrs. Main Routine here will sit back and say, thank you very much, whatever I called her before, Mrs. Smith, whatever. We'll call her Mrs. Main Routine, okay? And she's going to say, thank you very much. I got it. Now I'm going to take those results and pass it down to Mr. Display. And Mr. Display then will display those results back out to the screen as we normally have, all broken down, piece by piece by piece. Each one of these boxes now represents a procedure in your program. The next step of this is, though, is that these boxes can be broken down into further boxes, okay? And so what you need to do when you're considering your program is, part of your design now is to look at these particular boxes and sit back and say, what else do I need? If I need to validate just one thing, maybe you can just get away with the one box. But if I'm going to validate multiple things, I should have a box for each thing I'm validating. Remember, one purpose. So if I'm going to validate, in my case, base price and the trade-in from my example of VB Auto Center, I would have two more boxes here. And basically what will happen here is that, okay, that this one will be get and validate base price, okay? And this one will be, all I'm doing is just double clicking, getting in here, there you go, get and validate trade-in, okay? Does that make sense? And then what we would do is draw a line to it. Okay, these lines basically state, okay, that this, what these lines basically state is this. One, the main routine is going to call get and validate input. Get and validate input, it's going to call get and validate base. The word call means it's going to say go to this procedure, call this procedure, and whatever the code is in this procedure, it's going to run. Once it's finished, it comes back to that procedure. And so in this case, the main routine will call get and validate input. Get and validate input will call get and validate base price. Once it's done, it will then call get and validate. Let's see if I get my lines here. I have more trouble with lines on this. Get and validate trade-in. Once that's done, it'll come back to here. I think this was Mr. Validate, and he will get done, and he will go back to the main routine here. So what this structure chart is a representation of how you're going to break down your program. Okay? We will go through this a little bit more in another video to talk about how we do this and then how do we do our design, meaning our pseudocode. For the most part, our pseudocode remains the same, but what we're going to do is we're going to break up our pseudocode also into each one of these boxes. And it's very simple. You'll see how we do it. Calculations would be the same thing. I would take these calculations. I actually have a couple down here. I try to erase these. And I would say, what am I going to do in these calculations? What are the different things? And if I sit back and say, well, I'm just going to calculate the car price. Now, well, what am I going to do? Well, I got to calculate accessories and finish. Okay, well, that's one thing. I got to calculate, I guess, tax or subtotal, and then tax, and then finally the final total. Those are four different things with four different purposes. And so those calculations should then be broken down. Does that make sense? Again, what this requires you is to try to understand where we're going with this, which I showed you in the previous video. And then this is going to help you design it. And yeah, me talking about it for the first time, you might be sitting back going, what are you talking about? Well, all we're trying to do is take what you've written before and break it down into these three main sections. And then what you're going to do is break down each section, and based upon what you're doing in it and the different purposes or different things that's happening, you should break it down. If you recall, one of the things you did in calculations was you determined what all your outputs were and the logical order of those outputs. I contend that you should have a box to calculate each output that you actually discovered in the requirements. Recall that? And that would be called from the calculations. Does that make any sense? I hope it does. All right. I think we'll just continue on. Keep listening to everything, and hopefully it all comes together when we all get finished with this, okay? But this is called a structure chart. Once again, I'm using Visio. You can use anything, but if you have Visio, I highly recommend you use it, all right? In the next set of videos, we'll take VB Auto Center, and we'll really create the entire piece with this, and then we'll show you how to design it, and then finally, how to program it, okay?